The polished linoleum of the school hallway reflected the fluorescent lights in long, sterile streaks. Richard Sterling's reflection was a dark, sharp-suited interruption in the otherwise cheerful chaos of career day. He moved with the easy arrogance of a man who believed the world was a boardroom and he was perpetually the chairman. His gaze fell upon a 10-year-old girl with bright, intelligent eyes and two perfectly braided pigtails. Her name was Maya Thorne. She stood proudly beside a trifold poster board covered in diagrams of jet turbines and complex alloys. Beside her stood her father, Marcus Thorne, a tall, quiet man in a simple but well-pressed shirt and slacks. He had a stillness about him that seemed to absorb the noise of the hallway. "And what does your father do?" Sterling asked, his voice a smooth, condescending drawl that he likely mistook for charm. He had just finished a self-aggrandizing speech to a cluster of parents about his company, Sterling Aerospace, and its contributions to national defense. Maya's face lit up. "My dad is an engineer," she said, her voice clear and full of pride. "He's a material stress analyst at Sterling Aerospace. He makes sure the parts for the planes are strong enough so they don't break." Sterling glanced at Marcus, a flicker of something unpleasant, recognition mixed with contempt, crossing his features. He gave a small, dismissive laugh that was meant to be overheard. "An engineer, that's admirable," he said, but his tone dripped with insincerity. He then leaned down, bringing his face closer to Maya's, his expensive cologne a cloying invasion of the chalk and paper-scented air. "Let me give you a little piece of advice, young lady. It's important to have ambition. Your father, he's a technician, a functionary. It's important work, I suppose, but it's what people do when they can't lead." He straightened up, his eyes sweeping over the other parents and children who had fallen silent, watching the exchange. He was performing. "In the grand scheme of things," Sterling continued, his voice resonating with false authority, "your father was nobody important, just a name on a checklist. Remember that when you think about your own future." The words landed in the quiet hallway with the force of a physical blow. The light in Maya's eyes dimmed, her shoulders slumped, and her lip began to tremble. She looked from Sterling's smug face to her father's, her expression a silent plea for him to say something, to fight back, to correct this awful public humiliation. Marcus Thorne did not raise his voice. He did not defend his title or his honor. He simply placed a large, steady hand on his daughter's shoulder. His eyes, calm and unreadable, met Sterling's. He held the CEO's gaze for 3 long seconds, a silence more profound and damning than any shouted retort. In that silence, Sterling's bravado seemed to shrink, becoming brittle and hollow. Then, Marcus squeezed Maya's shoulder gently and turned her away from the man. He knelt down so he was at her eye level, his back to Sterling and the rest of the silent onlookers. "What he thinks doesn't matter, sweet girl," he whispered, his voice for her alone. "The work matters, the truth matters, that's all." He stood, took her hand, and with a quiet dignity that filled the space around them, he walked his daughter down the long, polished hallway, away from the trifold poster and the sneering CEO. They left a vacuum of stunned silence behind them, the air thick with the residue of a cruelty as casual as it was deep. If you have ever seen someone you love belittled by a person who believes power is a license for contempt, if you have ever believed that quiet integrity is worth more than loud arrogance, then you need to stay with this one until the end. 14 days earlier, the world was a place of quiet order. Marcus Thorne's home was a small, meticulously kept bungalow on a street lined with mature oak trees. Inside, everything had its place. It was not the cold order of a museum, but the warm, lived-in tidiness of a life built on precision and care. In the garage, which he had converted into a workshop, the scent of machine oil, solder, and wood glue hung in the air. Tools were not merely stored, they were arranged, each wrench and caliper resting in a foam-cut shadow of its own shape. This was his sanctuary, but the heart of the house was the small kitchen table where he and Maya did homework together every evening. He would review her math problems, and she would quiz him on the schematics he brought home, her small finger tracing the complex lines of a fuel injector assembly. Their life was a finely calibrated machine, running on mutual respect and quiet affection. At Sterling Aerospace, Marcus occupied a similar space of quiet competence. His lab was in the sub-basement of the main R&D building, a place executives rarely visited. It was a sterile, climate-controlled cleanroom filled with diagnostic machinery that hummed with a constant, low-frequency energy. He wore a white lab coat over his simple clothes, and his movements among the complex arrays were economical and precise. He was, as Maya had said, a material stress analyst. His job was to find the breaking point of things. The project on his bench was codenamed Ares. It was a next-generation variable cycle engine for a high-altitude reconnaissance drone, a project that represented billions in government contracts for Sterling Aerospace. Marcus's specific task was to certify the new composite turbine blades. They were marvels of engineering, woven from a proprietary carbon ceramic matrix, designed to withstand temperatures and pressures that would turn conventional alloys to slag. They were also Richard Sterling's pet project, developed by a new, cost-effective supplier he had personally championed. For a week, Marcus had been running the blades through the gauntlet. He subjected them to simulated thermal cycles, vibrational harmonics, and centrifugal force tests that mimicked tens of thousands of flight hours. The initial data was flawless. The blades performed exactly to specification, even exceeding them in some metrics. The project managers were pleased. The daily reports sent upstairs were glowing. But Marcus was not satisfied. There was a ghost in the machine, a flicker in the data so small it was statistically insignificant, a rounding error to anyone else. During the peak stress phase of the final test cycle, a resonance scanner detected a microscopic energy dissipation, a whisper of internal friction where there should have been absolute integrity. He isolated the test parameters and ran the sequence again. The same whisper. He ran it a third time, recalibrating the sensors to their highest possible sensitivity. This time, he saw it. Magnified 1,000 times on his monitor, a flaw appeared. Under a simulated load of 110%, a hairline fracture, no thicker than a spider's thread, propagated from the blade's leading edge. It was a catastrophic failure, contained only by the magnetic field of the test rig. He spent the next 48 hours confirming the finding. He tested 3 more blades from the same batch. Each one developed the same fracture under the same conditions. The composite matrix was unstable at the highest operational envelope. The blades were flawed. The Ares engine would fail. His report was a model of clinical detachment. It was 12 pages of pure data, stress-strain curves, thermal imaging captures, spectrographic analysis. There was no opinion, no speculation, only the empirical truth of the numbers. At the end of the report was a single declarative sentence. Component C-77B turbine blade fails to meet minimum safety and performance specifications for the Ares program. Certification denied. He printed the report, signed the last page with his neat block-lettered signature, and placed it in the internal routing envelope for the head of R&D, with a carbon copy for Richard Sterling's office. A signature to Marcus was a promise. It was his bond, not to the company, but to the truth of his work. 2 days later, he was summoned, not to the office of his direct supervisor, but to the top floor, to the CEO's suite. Richard Sterling's office was designed to intimidate. It was a vast expanse of dark wood, smoked glass, and brushed steel, with a panoramic view of the city that made the world outside seem small and insignificant. Sterling sat behind a desk the size of a small car, not working, but waiting. The 12-page report lay on the polished surface in front of him, looking flimsy and out of place. "Thorne," Sterling began, not bothering with pleasantries. "I've read your little analysis." He gestured to the report with a flick of his wrist, as if dismissing a piece of trash. "You seem to have found a problem." "The blades are flawed, Mr. Sterling," Marcus said, his voice even. He stood in the center of the large rug, refusing the chair that had been offered. "The blades are revolutionary," Sterling countered, his voice tightening. "They are the key to us coming in under budget and ahead of schedule. Do you have any idea how much is riding on the Ares program?" For this company? For your colleagues? I know what happens if one of them fails at 70,000 feet, Marcus replied. Sterling stood and walked around the desk, circling Marcus like a predator. The test parameters you used were extreme, unrealistic. 110% of maximum theoretical load. They will never encounter that kind of stress in the field. The specifications demand a 10% safety margin. It's not my margin, it's the Pentagon's. The blade failed, the data is conclusive. A vein throbbed in Sterling's temple. The data is an outlier, an anomaly. We're on a deadline, Thorne. The Department of Defense is breathing down my neck. We need to move these components into the production phase. I need your signature on that certification. Marcus's expression did not change. I can't sign it. This is not a request. Sterling's voice dropped, losing its smooth corporate veneer and revealing something harder beneath. I am ordering you to sign it. Rerun the test at 95%, write up a new report, and sign the certification. Is that clear? For the first time, Marcus's gaze hardened. You want me to falsify a safety report for a critical military component. It was a statement, not a question. Sterling's face flushed. He saw the intransigence in the man before him, the infuriating, unshakable integrity. It was a quality he did not understand and therefore despised. You're a technician, Thorne, a cog in a very large machine. You are not paid to think. You are paid to follow procedures and sign documents. Now, for the last time, are you going to sign the certification? No, Mr. Sterling, I am not. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. Sterling stared at Marcus, his mind clearly working, rearranging the pieces on his internal chessboard. He had expected compliance, perhaps some grumbling, but not this quiet, absolute refusal. It was like pushing against a wall of solid rock. Get out of my office, Sterling said finally, his voice a low hiss. Marcus turned without another word and walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft, expensive click. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that this was not the end of it. It was the opening move in a game he did not want to play, but one for which he was uniquely prepared. That evening, before he left the lab, he made a copy. Using a secure encryption protocol he had developed himself, he duplicated his entire project folder. The raw data, the final report, his notes, the communication logs, onto a small, unassuming thumb drive. He labeled it Maya Science Fair and slipped it into his pocket. It felt like a small, necessary weight against the coming storm. The storm arrived 3 days later. It came not as a thunderous explosion, but as a quiet, bureaucratic garroting. Marcus was called into a meeting with Human Resources and his department head, a nervous man who refused to make eye contact. On the table was a new report. It was his report, or rather, a twisted caricature of it. The data had been subtly altered. The stress curve was smoothed out, the peak load numbers recalibrated. The section detailing the microfracture was gone, replaced with a paragraph about transient resonance artifacts. The conclusion was the polar opposite of his own. Component C77B turbine blade meets and exceeds all performance specifications for the Ares program. And at the bottom, on the signature line, was his name. A forgery, and not a particularly good one. The M was too rounded, the T too sharp. It was an imitation of his signature, devoid of its character, much like the report itself was an imitation of his work. Alongside it was another document, a formal reprimand from Sterling, accusing Marcus of insubordination and a deliberate attempt to sabotage the Ares project timeline with unauthorized and excessive testing protocols. We're placing you on indefinite suspension, pending a full investigation, the HR manager said, reading from a script. The words were meaningless. They were both judge and jury. This was an execution. Marcus listened patiently. He did not argue or protest. He did not point out the forged signature or the falsified data. To do so in this room, with these people, would be like shouting into a hurricane. They were not agents of the truth. They were instruments of Sterling's will. Arguing with them would grant their process a legitimacy it did not deserve. He simply nodded. I understand. He was escorted to his lab to collect his personal belongings. His colleague, David Chen, a brilliant software engineer who had helped him design the diagnostic algorithms, watched with a pained expression. As Marcus boxed up a photo of Maya and a worn copy of a textbook, David slipped a piece of paper into his hand. "The server logs from your last test run were wiped, Marcus," David whispered, his eyes darting towards the security guard at the door. "Not just deleted, wiped clean. But there's a deep archive, a ghost backup for disaster recovery. Sterling doesn't know about it. I made a copy of the partition from the moment before the wipe. It's got your raw, unaltered data. It's on this drive." He pressed a tiny flash drive, identical to the one already in Marcus's pocket, into his palm. "Be careful," David said. Marcus clasped his friend's hand for a moment. "Thank you, David." As the security guard walked him out of the building, the same building where he had worked for 12 years, he felt not anger or despair, but a cold, clarifying focus. Sterling had not just fired him, he had tried to erase his work, to steal his name and attach it to a lie. He had turned Marcus's integrity into a weapon against him. The final, petty cruelty came a week later, at Maya's career day. Sterling, seeing Marcus there, must have viewed it as an opportunity too perfect to resist. He needed to complete the narrative, to not only fire the nobody, but to publicly humiliate him in front of his child, cementing his own power and demonstrating the consequences of defiance. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He had mistaken stillness for weakness and silence for surrender. It was a profound miscalculation. After they left the school, Marcus took Maya for ice cream. She was quiet in the car, the hurt from Sterling's words still a fresh wound. As she picked at her mint chocolate chip cone, she finally looked at him. "Is he right, Daddy?" she asked, her voice small. "Are you a nobody?" Marcus put his own spoon down and looked directly into his daughter's eyes. "Maya, there are two types of people in the world, people who build things and people who put their names on things. People who do the work and people who take the credit. Mr. Sterling is the second kind. He needs people to think he's important. That's his fuel. But it's not real. What's real is the work. What's real is making something that's strong and true, something you can stand behind. That's what we do. And that makes us somebody. Always." She considered this for a long moment, then gave a small nod, a little of the light returning to her eyes. The answer satisfied her because it was the truth, and she had been raised to recognize the feel of it. The next morning, the phone rang. It was not a number Marcus recognized. "Am I speaking with Marcus Thorne?" The voice on the other end was deep, formal, and carried an unmistakable air of command. "This is he." "Mr. Thorne, my name is General Wallace. I'm the Program Director for Advanced Propulsion Systems at the Pentagon. I understand you are no longer with Sterling Aerospace." Marcus's posture straightened slightly. He knew the name. General Wallace was a legend in the defense community, a former test pilot with an engineer's mind and a reputation for cutting through bureaucratic nonsense. "That's correct, General," Marcus said. "I'm calling about the Ares program," Wallace continued, his tone serious. "I have a report on my desk with your name on it, certifying the C-77B blades. But I also have a flag from my acquisitions team about a 2-week delay you supposedly caused prior to your departure. And now, Richard Sterling is pushing for an expedited production schedule to make up for lost time. The pieces don't fit. I knew your work on the F-35 intake valve redesign. You weren't the type to cause delays, and you weren't the type to miss a flaw." There was a pause. It was an opening. A door left slightly ajar in a locked house. "The report with my signature is a forgery, General," Marcus said, his voice perfectly level. "The blades are critically flawed. I have the unaltered test data to prove it." The silence on the other end of the line was different this time. It was not the cold silence of Sterling's office, but the focused silence of a powerful mind processing critical information. "I see," General Wallace said. "Mr. Thorne, I'm sending a secure courier to your location. I need to see that data. And I need you in Washington, tomorrow. A car will be at your house at 0600. The line went dead. Marcus hung up the phone. The board was changing. A new, more powerful piece was now in play. While Marcus was preparing his data, another conversation was taking place. Evelyn Sterling had been watching her father for weeks with a growing sense of unease. She was the company's chief operating officer, a position she had earned with a sharp mind and a grasp of logistics that often surpassed her father's. But he had been shutting her out of the Ares program, handling it personally, which was not his usual style. He preferred delegating. She had seen the insubordination report on Marcus Thorne, and it felt wrong. She had met Thorne once or twice in project reviews. He was quiet, meticulous, the opposite of a saboteur. Her father's explanation that Thorne was a disgruntled employee trying to create leverage for a promotion felt thin and rehearsed. Her suspicions led her to the company's deep archive, the disaster recovery server David Chen had told Marcus about. As COO, she had the highest level of clearance. She found the ghost partition, and on it, she found the truth. She sat in her sterile, modern office, the two reports open on her dual monitors. On the left was the official report, the one with the forged signature, its data clean and perfect. On the right was the original, pulled from the archive, its data messy, complicated, and terrifying. It showed the undeniable truth of the fractures. It was a digital smoking gun. She looked at the signature her father had approved. It was a lie attached to her family's name. The company her grandfather had built on a reputation for engineering excellence was being risked for one man's ego and a deadline. The realization settled on her not with a crash, but with a quiet, sickening finality. Water closing over a stone. She picked up her phone and made a call. Not to her father, but to the one person who could corroborate everything. "Mr. Thorne? This is Evelyn Sterling. I think we need to talk." The meeting took place in a secure, windowless conference room in the E-ring of the Pentagon. The air was cool and smelled of ozone and strong coffee. At the head of the long, polished table sat General Wallace. Flanking him were two other Air Force officials and a civilian analyst from the Department of Defense. Richard Sterling was already there, looking confident and relaxed. He had been told this was a final review to greenlight the expedited production schedule. He saw it as a victory lap. He nodded curtly to the generals, the picture of a confident defense contractor. At precisely 0900, the door opened. An aide showed in two more people. Marcus Thorne and Evelyn Sterling. The blood drained from Richard Sterling's face. His confident posture evaporated, replaced by a sudden, rigid tension. He looked from his daughter to Marcus, his eyes wide with disbelief and betrayal. "What is the meaning of this?" he stammered, looking at General Wallace. "This man is a disgruntled former employee under investigation for corporate sabotage." General Wallace ignored him. He gestured for Marcus and Evelyn to take the seats opposite Sterling. "We are here to review the certification of the C-77B turbine blade for the Ares program," the general said, his voice flat and cold. "Mr. Sterling, you have presented us with a report that indicates the component is sound. Is that correct?" "It is more than sound, General. It's a masterpiece of modern engineering," Sterling said, trying to regain his footing. "Excellent," Wallace said. He nodded to a technician, and the large monitor at the end of the room flickered to life. It displayed the neat, clean data from Sterling's falsified report. "This is the data you submitted." Sterling nodded, a thin, smug smile returning to his lips. "As you can see, flawless performance." "Now," Wallace continued, his voice dropping an octave, "let's look at the actual data." The screen changed. Now it showed Marcus's original findings. The jagged stress curves, the thermal imaging showing a bloom of heat at the leading edge. And then, a slow-motion simulation built from the sensor logs, showing the spider web of microfractures spreading through the blade until it disintegrated into dust. The room was utterly silent. "This data was recovered from a deep archive server at your company, Mr. Sterling," Wallace said, his eyes like chips of granite. "It was time-stamped 3 days before the forged report you submitted. Mr. Thorne, would you care to explain what we are looking at?" Marcus stood. He did not look at Sterling. He addressed the screen and the officials at the table. In a calm, methodical voice, he walked them through the test parameters, the resonance anomaly, and the precise point of failure. He used the dispassionate language of science, which, in that context, was more damning than any accusation. He wasn't telling a story, he was revealing a physical law. The blades were a ticking time bomb. When he finished, Evelyn Sterling spoke for the first time. "My father," she said, her voice steady despite the immense pressure, "ordered this data suppressed. He directed that a falsified report be created, and he approved the forgery of Mr. Thorne's signature to push the component through. He did this to avoid contract penalties and to protect the stock price. He knowingly and deliberately intended to supply the United States Air Force with defective and dangerous equipment." Every eye in the room was now on Richard Sterling. He was pale, his breathing shallow. The walls of his carefully constructed world were collapsing around him. "This is absurd," he blustered, his voice cracking. "A conspiracy. My own daughter, turning against me, colluding with a disgraced employee." General Wallace held up a hand, silencing him. He slid a document across the table. It was the signature page from the falsified report. "Our forensic document examiners confirmed this is a forgery, Richard. A poor one at that." He slid another document beside it. It was a federal warrant. "The Ares program is suspended, effective immediately. Sterling Aerospace's prime contractor status is under full review by the Inspector General. And you, sir, are the subject of a federal investigation into fraud, conspiracy, and violations of the Defense Production Act." Two men in dark suits, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward. They flanked Richard Sterling, their presence a quiet, immovable finality. His blustering ceased. He looked small and defeated, all the arrogance and power stripped away, leaving only a hollow shell. He didn't look at his daughter or at Marcus as they escorted him from the room. He just stared at the polished surface of the table, a man who had put his name on a lie and had finally been called to account for it. General Wallace stood and walked over to Marcus. He extended his hand. "Mr. Thorne, your integrity has likely saved the lives of pilots in a multi-billion-dollar defense program. On behalf of the United States Air Force, I thank you." Marcus shook his hand. It was a firm, solid grip. "I just did my job, General." Wallace allowed himself a small, rare smile. "Very few people can say that and mean it the way you do." 3 months later, the dust had settled. Richard Sterling was facing a raft of federal charges, his career over, his reputation in ruins. The board of Sterling Aerospace, in a desperate move to save the company, had appointed Evelyn Sterling as the new CEO. She had asked to meet Marcus at a small cafe not far from his home. The company was in crisis, and she was in the process of a massive, painful restructuring, rooting out the culture of fear and deception her father had cultivated. "I've created a new position," she said, after the coffee arrived. "Senior Vice President of Quality and Safety Assurance. It reports directly to me and has veto power over any project director, including myself. I want you to take it, Marcus." It was a powerful offer, a validation, a return to the world that had cast him out, but this time at the very top. Marcus considered it for a moment, stirring his coffee. He thought of the long hours, the endless meetings, the corporate politics that came with such a title. He thought of Maya, and the science fair, and the quiet evenings at their kitchen table. "Thank you for the offer, Evelyn. It's a good one," he said respectfully, "but I'm going to have to decline." Her face fell slightly. "I understand, after what my family—" "It's not that," he interrupted gently. "I'm a builder, an analyst. My place is with the work, not in a boardroom. But I have a counter-proposal." He leaned forward slightly. "Your company needs more than a new VP. It needs an independent conscience. Someone who isn't on the payroll, who isn't subject to internal pressures." He outlined his idea. He would form his own independent consultancy. Sterling Aerospace would be his first and primary client. He would serve as an outside auditor for all critical projects, a third-party validator with unrestricted access, reporting directly to the board and their government clients. He would work on his own terms, from his own lab. He would set his own hours. He would never have to choose between his work and his daughter again. Evelyn listened, a slow smile spreading across her face. It was a better idea. It was brilliant. It institutionalized his integrity, making it a permanent check on the company's power. It was exactly what they needed to regain the trust they had lost. "I accept," she said without hesitation. The final scene was not in a boardroom or a lab, but in the bright, noisy gymnasium of Maya's school. It was the annual science fair. In the center of the room, on a table draped in blue cloth, was a magnificent, large-scale model of the Ares drone. But this one was different. Maya, with her father's help, had redesigned the internal turbine structure. Her project, which won first prize, was titled, "Improving Material Integrity Through Geometric Resonance Damping." Marcus stood at the back of the crowd, watching his daughter confidently explain the principles of harmonic stress and composite layering to a pair of impressed judges. He was not an executive. He was not a vice president. He was just a father, beaming with a quiet, profound pride. He felt a presence beside him. It was Evelyn Sterling. She was dressed down in jeans and a simple sweater, looking more relaxed than he had ever seen her. "She's brilliant," Evelyn said softly, watching Maya. "She is," Marcus agreed. "Thank you for the invitation. Maya sent it to my office." "She said you needed to see what a real engineer looks like," Marcus said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the vibrant, hopeful chaos of the science fair. The work was good. The truth was sound. His daughter was happy. In the grand scheme of things, Marcus Thorne was the furthest thing from a nobody. He was the foundation on which everything else was built. And for the first time in a long time, the world seemed to be in its right and proper order.